Welcome everyone to the second of 3 webinars Flight Global is running as part of this week's FIA Connect event, for which we are the official media partner. I'm Max Kingsley-Jones, and I'll be your host today as we examine the next generation of commercial aircraft and what they might look like and how the crisis may have shaken everything up. Flight Global is presenting this webinar in association with Embraer, and I'm delighted to be joined today by several highly respected industry leaders who, between them, have probably had more influence on the current crop of airliners than anyone else. So Tim Clark, who is president of Emirates Airline and has been part of the leadership team since it was created in 1985. And Steve Udvar-Hazy, founder and chairman of Air Lease Corporation, and before that, of course, the creator of ILFC. And from our webinar partner, Embraer, we're delighted to be joined by Ian Mayer, who was recently appointed as President and Chief Executive of Embraer Commercial Aviation. Just before we start, just a quick bit of housekeeping. This discussion is timed for about 1 hour, and we will have many discussion points already planned, but I would also like to try and answer as many of your questions as we can. And you can post those via the text box on the screen. We're probably going to have quite a large number of questions. And so I have a colleague, Modo Morrison, who's going to be selecting from all your questions. He'll be filtering those and putting them through to me to pose to the panel. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We were just thinking about this should be Farnborough Week, of course. And 2 years ago, we were at Farnborough expecting to see some new product launches in the coming months and years, and then lots of things have happened since then. Probably one of the most crucial things actually was the accident last year to the 737 MAX, which caused the grounding and then a deep dive into the certification processes. And although it's only just over a year since that happened, it's already probably changed the shape and the attitude towards certification and product development for a generation. So I just think before we look sort of over the horizon at some of the potential developments, we should maybe scrutinize exactly how the MAX's accident and the fallout from that could actually change the way the OEMs think about their product development plans. So maybe I could turn to Steve, who's obviously been a big customer for a lot of all new aircraft and derivative aircraft. And Steve can maybe just talk us about how you think that the MAX accident may play into the thinking by the OEMs. Sorry, Steve, I think you're muted.
Strategy.
Great, thanks, Steve.
One strategy has been to develop an all-new aircraft. And I think good examples of that are the 787 and the A350. Both of them were relatively clean sheet designs. The other philosophy has been to emphasize derivatives. And probably the two most interesting examples of that are the 747. When you look at the evolution of the 747-100 since 1969, all the way through 747-200s, 300s, 400s, the 747 SP, the 747-8 Intercontinental. So you're looking at a period of almost 55 decades of evolution of a basic design. But even more importantly, let's look at the 737. The 737 was certified in 1967, not long after the introduction of the jet age. So we've had 53 years of 737 flight operations throughout the world, and more derivatives than any other commercial aircraft, starting with the 737-100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, and then, of course, the MAX 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we have more than a dozen different variations from the original prototype that was launched by Lufthansa in 1967. These certification standards, design standards, technology levels in the mid-60s were entirely different than what we're facing today and in the future. Yet this airplane was evolving successfully with aerodynamic changes, new engines, new avionics, new systems. But it's based on the original 707 fuselage. In fact, the cockpit section, the fuselage diameter, and a lot of the basic systems were based on the 707, 727 technology. And that's what it evolved from. If that aircraft was designed today in its current form, it would probably not meet all the latest certification standards. I'm not saying it wouldn't be safe or it wouldn't be appropriate, but today's standards versus the standards in the 60s are totally different. So what are we looking at in the future? We're looking at a continuation of this philosophy, like at Embraer, where they took a successful design platform of the E-jets, and then with a new engine and other new technologies, they evolved into the E2. We've seen Airbus do this with aircraft like the A321neo XLR. And so we're going to continue to see these derivative developments, but where we have major milestone step changes are with brand new designs, clean sheet paper designs. But those involve far greater cost, far greater investment, longer lead times, and more risk of success and market penetration. I personally enjoy the new stuff because that's where we make great steps forward in terms of advancement of economics, operating characteristics, customer experience, and so forth. So I very much look forward to the next decade and see who has the courage, the backbone, and the financial resources and the technological innovation to create new products that will be the basic airplanes of the future into many more decades.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And I'll ask Guyon in a moment about the thinking at Embraer as an OEM, but I'd like to ask Tim first, because Tim's been behind the launch of all new airplanes, 380 being probably the most prominent one, but also impressive derivative designs like the 777-300ER and then subsequently the 777X. So Tim, have you changed your thinking recently in light of what we've discovered from the investigations into the MAX, or are you still confident that derivative designs have a future?
The derivatives are I mean, Steve gave a very elegant history of the primary aircraft types that we are still flying today, and it is indicative of, in some respects, a reluctance by the manufacturers and to an extent led by the airline community to branch out into completely new aircraft types. The 787, more recently the 350, were a real departure from the original thinking of the derivative sort of nature that we've been experiencing over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And I think that had what happened recently, not only with the MAX, but obviously with this pandemic, and the pandemic has had far more economic consequences than the MAX has done, we has clipped, dare I say it, use the pun, clipped the wings of and the appetite of the airframers, and to an extent the propulsion, to really embark into new grounds into design, application of technology, propulsion, etc. I think we were moving at quite a good pace, and I'm not saying that something really earth-shattering, game-changing was going to come out post the 757, the A350 and the 787. I certainly believe that the single aisle certainly needed a lot of attention. Why? Because as we saw the evolution, growth of low cost and the peculiar requirements of low cost and single aisle, we tried to fix up one particular type to meet all the requirements of everybody. But I think that in the future, it is time that we looked at the way we go about serving the needs of this low-cost operation. And therein lies a need to redesign, possibly think what single aisle is going to be. It's not going to be A320 and a 737. It has to be various types of that, which do different jobs. Now, as far as certification is concerned, and Steve is absolutely right. You know, you were building and designing aircraft in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, which where the design techniques, the technology, aerodynamics, propulsion, etc., were significantly different, believe it or not, than what they are today. But I do believe the regulators have grown with the changing technology and changing design, metallurgical solutions, materials now being used in aircraft. I think there has been a departure from the rigors of certification, perhaps evident what happened with the MAX. And by that I mean the passing over of the actual regulation of what people were doing in plant and being employed by, in this case, Boeing's people. I dare say they do it in Airbus. So as technology grew and more embedded software started to appear in aircraft like the 737 and A320, and some of those things we still don't know about. They're not flight control critical. They're not propulsion critical. They may be to do with lighting or heating or whatever. But the temptation was to start doing it. So you've got to be a little bit wary of all of this. And the regulators, when they get their mojo back and interdict far more readily and more, I'm not saying they haven't been doing a good job, but there's been a certain amount of relaxation. That has come back with a vengeance now. And so you'll see that we talk about the 777X, I expect that to be subjected to a rigorous certification process along the ways that it always used to be done, where the regulators, independent of the manufacturers, are actually getting on with their job and doing what they need to be doing. Both manufacturers produce outstanding aircraft, but the pressures to get aircraft out of the door, the pressures to meet the cash flow requirements, the pressures to meet shareholder requirements, market cap, etc., in my view, has occluded what was an eminently safe and efficient way of regulating the build of current aircraft and involvement in the new build and the design and the application of new technology into new airframes and engine. If we can get that back, and we can populate the regulators with people who are equally qualified in aircraft design, both aerodynamics, propulsion, etc., and they're working for the government and they can liaise with, but watch very carefully what is happening, then I think we can expect that in future, we've learned a lot from the MAX, that these aircraft will be coming out with everything known to everybody, including the pilot community. So if we get that right, and I'm not optimistic about the airframers getting their teeth into new aircraft. I think they'll do their back of house research, but actually, as Steve mentioned, that the cost of a new build is probably, if the truth be known, between 20 and $30 billion, with fairly extensive timelines, and so there's no appetite for that at the moment. But I'm sure they're working on it. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Thanks, Tim. We'll circle back on some of those points because there's a lot of different aspects to it. There's the single aisle, there's the wide body, there's that mid-market to look at. But I wanted to ask Ian about this because by my calculation, listening to Steve's little history of the 737, I think they've re-engined that aeroplane 3 times actually, with each time with another iteration of CFM56. You've done the E-Jet once. You've gone from GE to Pratt & Whitney. And obviously that program is relatively in its infancy. It's just they've just come into service the last couple of years. Do you envisage well, firstly, what drove that decision to go with re-engine rather than all new? And then do you envisage another iteration of the E-Jet in 20 years time, or do you think that things are changing now fundamentally for the way OEMs look at that kind of concept?
Well, first of all, Max, thank you for having Embraer on this webinar. It's a couple of good points brought forward by Steve and Tim. I think Tim's absolutely right. It's about the certification process. I think if we as an industry want to keep continuing our product to make it more efficient and more economically and environmentally friendly, we need to improve the platforms. And I think, of course, comparing the 737 to the E-Jets, to your point, the E-Jet was certified in the 2000s and the E2 was only the first iteration. It was not, despite what many people think, just a re-engine. It was a complete revamp of the E-Jets. We changed the majority of the systems. We put new engines on, we put a new wing on, we put a new tail on. So effectively, it's almost a clean sheet aircraft if you look at it on the platform. but it was certified as a derivative. And I think certifying a derivative, there's nothing wrong with that. And we should, as an industry, make sure that we can keep doing that to continue the development, any further improvements of the platforms that we have. Of course, we had to improve the EJETs. If we compare like for like, we're talking about a 17+% improvement in terms of fuel burn, which is an incredible number. And I think if the technology is there in the future, those are the kinds of improvements you have to achieve if you want to do a derivative again. I think it's too early to say. To be honest, it all depends on what the market demands. Obviously, there's more and more demand for environmentally friendly, for CO neutral transport. There's a lot of pressure from governments now emerging on getting more environmentally friendly aircraft into the market. So I think the next couple of years are going to be very interesting to see what kind of technologies will come available for the OEMs to build their new platforms on. And depending on that technology, we'll have to see whether that's doable in a derivative or whether we have to look at an all new platform. But in all fairness, I think it's a bit early to say, but I don't think, in summary, we can say, well, doing a derivative is more difficult from a certification perspective than do an all new platform. I think we should make sure as an industry that we can do both.
Yeah, I know when you talked to Airbus about the decision they took in 2010 to launch the Neo, it looked like a brave decision at the time because Boeing was expecting to launch an all-new airplane, the NSA, I think it was called at the time, and they didn't. Of course, they went with the MAX. But Airbus tell me, that the Tom Williams, I know talking to Tom about this, he said that we always benchmarked an all-new airplane versus a re-engined airplane, and we could see that the economics in terms of the non-recurring costs, etc., didn't warrant at that stage an all-new airplane because the engines were delivering such a benefit even on a re-engined aircraft. That's the formula you have to play with every time. I just wonder whether with certification now being slightly different in wake of the MAX, you would think that in a different way. But the point you made, Tim, was interesting around, and obviously alluded to by Steve with his 737 breakdown. We're looking at an airplane even today with the A320, which is effectively the cross-section of an aircraft that entered service in the late 1950s, the 707, give or take a few centimeters or inches in terms of width, 6 abreast, single aisle, and a cargo hold underneath. So the fundamental change of the way aircraft are conceived and the markets for which they're conceived for must at some point change. The NMA was the airplane that was promising to do that from what we were hearing. We don't know where that program is now. So I suppose the question I would put to both Steve and Tim initially, and I'd come to Ian about his thoughts on Embraer's position on this, is when do you see, what do you see as the catalyst for a complete change in the philosophy of how you draw a fuselage cross-section for a single-aisle aeroplane and how you basically make that work economically in terms of integrating the propulsion system? Steve, maybe you have some thoughts.
Well, I think the disruption in design concepts is not going to come from Airbus and Boeing. I think it's going to come from smaller, innovative players. Just like in the automotive industry, it took Tesla, which was a newcomer, to basically change the views of the major auto manufacturers to electric technology. So we need disruptors that may not necessarily be financially successful, but could actually instigate innovation that otherwise would not come from the large established OEMs. But in terms of fuselage design, if you're looking at a single aisle solution, and Tim touched on the low cost segment, there aren't a lot of choices other than maybe to increase the aisle width a little bit and maybe create a little better user-friendly customer experience and ease of loading and unloading the aircraft. That there isn't a lot that you can do other than small changes to sort of optimize the cabin interior and the aerodynamic design. So unless you're willing to roll the dice like Boeing was going to with the NMA, where you design a small twin aisle airplane, which then creates a lot more flexibility on interior configurations and perhaps accelerates the ability of the airplane to load and unload. However, with the pandemic, we have a whole new landscape when it comes to passenger health concerns and who do you sit next to and how close are you to another individual during the boarding process, on board, using the lavatories, et cetera. So I think that's going to be a gray area for a little while. And I don't see any manufacturers willing to make a bet on a specific configuration in that regard. But I see more opportunities on the propulsion side, on systems, and maybe combining some electric technology, hybrid technology with current engine technology, which cannot be any more pushed into double-digit gains. I think this last round of turbofan technology, unless you go to an ultrafan concept, there's no way to get double-digit fuel gains. The other problem I see is that when you increase the capital cost of these airplanes substantially, it offsets the gains on fuel burn. So yeah, you can achieve a 10% fuel burn advantage, but if the airplane is 40% more expensive than what it's replacing, you lose the economics of that fuel burn advantage. So I'm looking forward to disruptors that will come up with new concepts, which then the OEMs can eventually latch onto and make significant improvements in design of single aisles. Wide bodies is a whole different subject. Tim is a better expert on that. But certainly there's a lot more latitude there. Although currently I don't see really a reason for the OEMs to develop new wide body aircraft. I think what we have now is sufficiently adequate for the next 10 to 15 years in terms of what we have already on the table.
Thanks, Steve. I think Airbus and Boeing just breathed a sigh of relief hearing you say that. You mentioned the disruptors. There was a little firm down in Toulouse called Sud Aviation that did a bit of disrupting with twin-engined airplanes in the...
Yeah, the Caravelle. Look at the Caravelle.
Well, and the Caravelle originally, yeah, with its twin Caravelle. And then the Airbus came along as the first big twin. And there's another little disruptor came out of Montreal about 15 years ago, which is really what resulted in the Neo and the Max. So
Right.
It's interesting where these disruptions come from. You don't expect them always. And I was going to ask Tim, actually, because you're a disruptor as well, Tim. Of course, in your market, you know, Emirates is probably the ultimate disruptor in the airline sector in the last 30 odd years. So you know all about doing that as well. From your perspective, you've helped shape so many aircraft over the last 25 years or so, both in Seattle and in Toulouse. From your perspective, if you were at a different stage of your career in the industry, what would you be pushing for to ensure you had the right product to be a disruptor as an operator in the next 15 years? Where would you be pushing the operators, the OEMs to focus?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer, Max. The Emirates business model, which I'm not going to go on at great length, was one that responded to scale on a timeline that had been unheard of in civil aviation. And our willingness to take the risk and push the manufacturers to build the airplanes that we needed to scale up the point-to-point demand as we globalized. Well, that's history. So if I was looking forward as to what is the civil aviation structure going to look like in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? In the short term, frankly, I don't see too much change. I see less players for the reasons that we've talked about. And I see a risk-averse nature of boards and shareholders in both the OEMs and the airline community. I think we've got to live with that. In terms of innovation and disruptors, both within Boeing and Airbus, we have outstanding capabilities. We have creative minds, innovators, disruptors themselves. But of course, going back to my point, in the end, you've got to have dynamic leadership, vision, and people who are prepared to take the risk and get on out there. So if I can circle back to what I was saying about the low-cost type aircraft, you would then engage with all the low-cost operators, do the gap analysis between those that are full service or quasi-full service and what the low-cost actually want, whether it be turn times, whether it be access to the aircraft itself. Do you go high wing, mid wing, etc., etc.? But actually then start looking at what people want, not with what they are told to make use of, because the 737 is a classic, as is the 320 since 1988, of people adapting their business models to the unit rather than the other way around. And as business models have grown, in those that are convergent in their aspirations, and by that I mean low cost tend to be a very similar, safe, simple business model, and that they have adapted those aircraft to it. So think, how would you do that with the technology that I have today, with propulsion that I have today, with the requirements of the airfields that they have today, which are hugely congested? How would you get around that? Now, that's something I would be looking at, engaging with minds in the business, and I can name a few, who would probably help out in that design. So then you've got to have the ability of the boards, the investors, the shareholders say, yeah, let's do this, let's get on with it, and let's not be conditioned by the baggage of the legacy of the past. There is quite a lot of that, which conditions the way they go. Steve made a very good example of the way automotive has taken design from 19 whatever it was, the Model T Ford, to where we are today, and they have constantly turned their attention to innovation, design, embodiment of latest technology, whatever that may be, and the things that technology delivers for them. So you've got to have that. I'm just saying, unfortunately for all of us, this major conditioning period of our lives since February of this year has changed, taken the eye off the ball with regard to that kind of what somebody may say, it's the luxury aspect of the job. At the moment, everybody is fighting for cash survival, including the OEMs, and they are making very, very radical decisions as to what's going on. That's not to say that they don't have the capability to think ahead. And I think as Steve said, the 350 and the 787 will be with us for a long time. But as far as wide bodies are concerned, and it's the argument I tried to persuade Airbus, and there were people in Airbus who agreed with me, that had we taken the 380 and applied the technologies of the 350 in this case, and to a lesser extent, the 787, in the application of composite technology, the systems that were no longer hydraulic driven ones, all electric, etc., the improvement of the aerodynamics, as we learned far more about how a composite wing provides great lift over drag capability that they've never seen before. And if we'd applied that to something as big as the 380, we could have actually stripped out a lot of cost of operation. And we could have actually designed the way that future aircraft could have been presented to the public. And as Steve said, if you've got twin aisle, you've got much more capability of doing configuration adaptation, which suits people like us who are very customer focused about what we do. So, I'm if it was me and if I was in the game without the pandemic, I think I would be trying to impart to manufacturers what I think they should be doing. I'm not a specialist in single aisle because we don't operate them, but I think the MAX has been a huge wake up call. And there is from all of this, from the hybrid, well, I say not the hybrid, but from the Phoenix, from the ashes rises the Phoenix. The MAX will teach Boeing a lot of lessons and may get them to rethink exactly what they need to be doing going forward. That have they reached the end of the single aisle? In this case, the 737 is the 8, 9, and 10 MAX. Is it? If this is it, are we going to stay with this aircraft for the next 50 years? When I came into the business 45 years ago, and Steve about the same time, the notion that you would be looking at the same kind of thing was kind of anathema to our thinking, but actually that's what happened. And it was in the small areas and in the military applications that we saw some astounding revolutionary applications of propulsion aerodynamics, which transpose into speed and everything else. So, you know, I'm not optimistic because of the timing. I always remain optimistic that we have the capability, we have the creativity, we have the intellectual powers to come and address and produce aircraft that in 50 years' time will shock and stun us now. I really believe, perhaps not the time, give this 3 or 4 years. Let's have a look at how we go about dealing with the environmental aspects, which is a really good thing to happen to all of us, because it's making us really think hard about what we need to do. It's a bit like this development of the vaccine for COVID-19. You know, it's accelerated at such a pace that something used to take 10 years ago could be with us in 4 months. That is the capability of the human mind when it really needs to put its mind to it, get going. And I honestly think that this is something we could do. Technology is moving at such a pace, regardless of the pandemic. The application of that technology into all the systems, aerodynamics, propulsion, design of aircraft is there on the table. Use it, and you'll produce something probably, I would say, within the next 5 or 7 years. The NMA, as you say, didn't get out of the starting blocks, but hey ho, it may still. I think there was quite an interest in that in the community, including us.
Yeah, we were ready to sign for 100 of them.
Right.
There you go.
I agree with Tim. I think we need to see 3 or 4 years of stabilization in the airline industry, because in the end, those are the customers that have to buy and finance those new technologies. And I think the OEMs need to recover from the hospital that they're in right now, where they've had the greatest step change in production outlook in the last 30 years. So I think we need to see the patients on both sides kind of recover financially, and in terms of regaining optimism and the willpower and the courage to embark on new designs. I just don't see the 2 big OEMs or the 3 large engine manufacturers do anything that involves a huge capital investment and risk from a business model point of view. And I agree with Tim. We have the brain power, the technology, the innovation, the capability, but I think we have capital constraints, particularly after the damage that this pandemic has caused across the whole commercial aviation sector. You know, all down the supply chain with the airlines, even airports, and of course the OEMs and their suppliers. So we need to restabilize, get back to health before we can really think about new airplane designs in a meaningful way.
Well, I'm going to ask, thank you, Steve. I'm going to ask our OEM representative on the panel, Ian, about this, because hearing Steve talking about the disruptors in the market in the past and the future, you've been a disruptor at Embraer. You've also been disrupted, I think, by the C series as it was. That kind of was which disrupted everybody, I think. So do you see an opportunity now for Embraer, now the Boeing JV's in the past, and that's that was obviously a distraction for you and for Boeing for some time, to maybe become a disruptor of your own in that sector as maybe the sub mainline sector merges with the bottom end of the mainline sector, you know, the A319, the 737-700 MAX 7 size category, and an opportunity there for Embraer to leverage its market share just on the edge of that, and produce a product or develop products that would allow you to take the big guys on.
Well, that's a good question. I think if you look at the current situation, of course, we're talking about the two big guys who are heavily hit by COVID, and so is Embraer at the moment. But I think we're fortunate enough that our segment is now more in demand than ever. If you look at the airlines around the world, how they're using the E-jets. I mean, E-jets were parked a lot less than narrow bodies. And if you look today, how many E-jets are flying in China, in Europe, in Africa, in North America, they're all coming back. So I think that is a difference. I think Embraer, of course, we're looking forward, but let's not forget we just delivered the E2 to the market. So that is a brand new platform for us. We also had a brand new KC-390 on the military side, and we had the Legacy 450 on the executive side. So we invested large sums of money in the development of new platforms. I think, as said by Tim, I think the technology needs to develop. I think that's not something that the OEMs will do or just the engine manufacturers. I think it's something that we really need to do as an industry to get to a technology that's actually going to help us from an environmental perspective. Embraer is definitely very active on the Embraer X side, which is a branch of Embraer who's focused on innovation and disruptive technologies. We're working, for example, with Uber on Uber Elevate, with a small vehicle on electricity. But I think those kind of technologies, of course, a long shot to get those available for narrow body aircraft. So if there's going to be a new technology available, I think it is going to be in the regional segment. I think it's too early to call when that will be. And as said before, the risk of building a platform for a company or for any OEM basically, which is not successful in the end, is just too great. So we really need to make sure that the technology is ready to go and ready for application. That it's not only going to be an aircraft that delivers the environmental and fuel burn efficiency. But it's also a reliable airplane that's still affordable, etc. So it's all about the total package. So I think the regional segment is probably where it can be achievable first. But being currently in a COVID situation, we have still some other fish to fry, as was just mentioned. We need to get out of the crisis. Embraer's got a good financial position. I think we're heavily focused on cash, and we didn't have any cancellations on our order book, but we did have delays. So we need to get through this, and then we'll think about the next steps and those developments.
Thanks, Johan. That actually was partly linked to a question from Greg Ehrman, who put a question in about, so I kind of wrapped it into a question I had for you, which is really about where you go with the Boeing JV behind you now, whether you go up or down. I know you had been talking, John Slattery had been talking about a turboprop. And that was obviously kind of the proviso there was it was linked to the JV. If that ever does happen, if Embraer was to do that, what would you think the power plant would be? Are you expecting it still to be a conventional gas turbine turboprop, or would you expect there's an opportunity for it to be a hybrid, or is it too soon?
Yeah, I think timing is of the essence here. It's too soon to say. Of course, we still have it on the drawing table. We've as I said, we have other priorities at the moment, and we've been also sharing with the market that we're looking at partnerships on products and on engineering services. So we're not sure yet where the TP is going, although we do believe there's a sound business case for the aircraft and for the segment, a more CO2 efficient vehicle, but the type of propulsion on that aircraft is still TBD.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a betting person, I think conventional is more likely if you were making a decision today, but we'll have to see. There's a kind of elephant in the room really for OEMs and for the operators, which is the environmental credentials that we need to be working hard on. We are doing a great job as an industry, obviously, with our efficient aircraft, particularly at the moment with none of them flying. They're not burning any carbon. But once the market recovers, we need to remember our commitments as an industry. And some of those commitments are going to be hard to meet if we don't get the technology moving fast. I know engine technology alone is probably just going to, in a normal world, counteract the growth of the industry. If it ever does start to get back to the old levels, which hopefully it will within 2 or 3 years. I just wonder whether we are going to see the legislation, or we're going to see the certification authorities actually putting more pressure through regulatory onto the OEMs and the operators to have to bite the bullet and take those risks that Tim talked about and actually commit before we get to halfway through the 21st century to something significant. What's your view when you talk to your customers, sorry, Steve, when you speak to the airlines that you supply airplanes to?
Well, there has been a turning point just in the last 48 hours. For the first time, the US regulator, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is coming out with a whole new set of regulations on this very subject. And this is unprecedented because so far it's been primarily the European arena has had the greatest sensitivity to noise and emissions. And now, as predicted, it's migrating into the US, North America, and then others will follow in the more developed parts of Asia, like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So I think that's one of the reasons that an OEM has to be extremely careful on launching a new airplane design, because you do want to have a production run that goes out to at least 2 or 3 decades. So what you don't want to do is design an airplane in 2021, 2022 that 10 years from now will not meet the environmental landscape in terms of the regulatory framework at that time. So there's a risk there. And politically speaking, the green impact in politics and in government is increasing, not decreasing. So we want to make sure that air transportation is not looked at as a destroyer of the planet. And there's just way too many people out there that portray the airline industry as being a much worse polluter than if you look at the actual numbers, the actual percentages. We're an easy victim, a visible victim. So I think we need to be very mindful of this regulatory trend toward a high degree of regulation and ultimately taxation of an industry that is sort of perceived to be polluting the earth. So we need to be extremely mindful of what airplanes are designed going forward, and whether they use carbon fuels, or are we going to begin a transition, particularly in the short haul sphere, to aircraft that are less dependent on carbon fuels and transitions, just like we're seeing that now with the automotive industry, trucks, buses, to more environmentally friendly propulsion. And I know that's another subject that you'll cover tomorrow, but I do see the regulatory tightrope getting more intense in the next decade. And that will have a profound effect on the airline industry and how it's taxed, and then how the OEMs will have to respond to those new realities.
Yeah, well, interestingly, thanks for the commercial for tomorrow's webinar, Steve. We are looking at disruptive technology in the engine, in the propulsion sector tomorrow on our FIA Connect webinar program, which Murdo Morrison, my colleague, will be chairing. No, sorry, yes, he will be chairing that. But I'm just curious as well, because we've got, we've got this this regulatory commitment. We've also got this CORSIA commitment. It means that there's not really anywhere to hide now. The industry has to not just talk about being environmentally friendly. I know it has been demonstrating that with its fleet renewals, but it really needs to deliver on that. And if the engine technology isn't the way forward to make that happen in the near term, because of the risks and as you say, Steve, the risks around the fact that you may be creating something that's going to be obsolete within 10 years due to regulatory changes, we need to make sure we have the right landscape, regulatory landscape, and the visibility on what that landscape is going to look like before people will commit investment. When the Airbus or the French government gave the financial bailout to the French industry,
France. I mean, that was a good example of the constraints that they want to eliminate a lot of the short haul flying in Europe.
Yeah, and they also want Airbus to develop an all new, highly efficient regional aircraft, as well as an A320 successor within, well, less than 15 years from now. I mean, if you think how long it takes normally to get an airplane from paper to launch to into service, we've got to get moving with this. So I don't know, Tim, you've been involved with clean sheet launches. Do you think that that's achievable? An A320 successor in service from 2033 with a demonstrable step in every way?
I think when they moved from the 320 to the 320neo, And if you recall in Farnborough, I don't know how many years ago it was, that John Leahy, who was then the commercial director of Airbus, said he could almost guarantee a 22% step change reduction in fuel burn because of propulsion. And yes, whether it was that, I'm not altogether sure, but I know it was significant. And the reason for that was that the propulsion, manufacturers had sat on their hands for many, many years and had not adapted the latest technology, simply because they had 6,000 aircraft on one side of the Atlantic ordered and the other on the same. So there was no real incentive for them to do that. The environmental thing really caught on in about 2005, 2006, 2007, and it then became a movement as big as it is today. So I understand that. We are all trying to deal with it. As Steve says, we don't get enough credit about it, but we've been banging our drum about that for so long, but we are still held out to be one of the pariahs in the business. So as Steve said, in propulsion, on carbon-based propulsion, hydrocarbon-based propulsion, is there anywhere else we can go on this? Is there going to be a step change? Is there going to be double-digit reduction in costs and fuel, etc.? No, I don't believe there will be. I'm sorry to say that. I'm not a great fan or rather a believer of electric propulsion in aircraft. I use the example of flying a 600-ton all-up weight 380 for 14 hours at 550 miles an hour with a payload of 60 tons on board. Now, I don't quite know how that is going to transpose into a different type of propulsion. I don't think it's there for us at the moment. We're nowhere near it. What we should be doing is thinking how we go about getting power to not just the airline community and the airframers, but in general. So if you're going to use sustainable fuels to generate electricity, if you're going to do a lot of carbon capture, which should be going on at a pace, you are starting to eliminate the carbon from the atmosphere using far more measurable, realistic, proven technology than going after the airline community, which really is at its wit's end, trying to think, as would be the airframers, to think, how are we going to meet the demands when the Joe Public is out there thinking we're going to have electric propellered or aircraft flying for 10 hours or whatever it may be, because they've seen an aircraft fly across the English Channel with an electric motor. Now, I'm not knocking technology and how that could go, but I don't understand the mass. It doesn't stack up for me, given the enormous power that you need to get an aircraft of the size of a 380 or anything else to do the missions that we want. Secondly, we need to educate the people who are legislating. I don't think we're linking the dots with a lot of them. All the political agendas are so great, it's very difficult for us to get listened to and for people to understand what's going on. But I've always said that the way around it also is to create a almost a global council of all the heads of businesses, irrespective of what they could be in automotive, they could be in engineering, they could be in pharmaceuticals, etc., airlines, airframers, whatever, and collectively bring all the work that they've been doing in their various sectors in environmental spheres, and see what cross-fertilization could come about. What tends to happen is manufacturers of cars do one thing, aircraft do another, ships, maritime will do another, whatever. Cross-fertilize the technology. Look what you can actually see and get from others by having an open forum which has no political agendas. I'm not saying keeping the politicians out of it, but get the best engineering and research brains and the innovators and the disruptors together under major champions of those particular businesses and see what could happen. And that is the kind of thing where I can see you can then marshal everything you've got on the planet today, which is slightly compartmentalized by industry, by sector. Bring it into the airframe, bring it into propulsion if you think there's something you can learn about that, and see and go forward on that. But I know you're going to have to think tomorrow about, but believe me, a 380, 600 tons? No, I don't think so.
I would go a step further, Max. I think even a narrow body at today, if you would fly that with batteries, I think you need 50 times the weight of a narrow body to the distance, right?
And
That's not gonna work. So I fully agree. We need to, as a global planet, we need to reduce CO2 there where it's the cheapest. And unfortunately, we are in an industry where we're just in the most complex application of fuels. So I think, indeed, alternative fuels, biofuels, offsetting programs, I think that's for sure the short-term way to go. And before we fly bigger aircraft fully on CO2 neutral means, I think that's going to take a lot of time. That's not going to happen within a couple of years, I believe.
No.
Maybe on a really small scale, on really small distance, as I said, in the regional segment, who knows? But indeed, an A380 is definitely the other end of the spectrum, but I think there's a lot of types below that where it's going to be a challenge as well.
I agree with Tim that we've got to take the bureaucrats and the politicians out of the design parameters for the next series of new airplane developments. We cannot allow those kind of individuals that don't really have a good understanding of what the capabilities and limitations of an airplane design involve. We cannot let them dictate how airplanes are going to be designed and operated in the future, because otherwise we're going to have catastrophic results on the airline industry, and its impact on global commerce, trade, GDP impact could be catastrophic. So I think I agree with Tim. We got to get the smart people together and come up with parameters, designs, and an avenue forward, a path forward on how do we attack this problem, solve the environmental issues, but do it in a smart, practical way rather than arbitrary statistical limitations that may not be able to be met by the airline industry.
Thanks, Steve. That sentiment about politics and bureaucrats could have been written over the memorial stone for the British aircraft industry 20 years ago. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes to run, and thanks for all your great insights so far. We've tackled a few of the questions, either directly or indirectly, that have come through. I don't think we can ignore something. We talked about disruptors, Steve and Tim mentioned that, and I just wanted to talk about the insurgents, if you like, into the market, particularly the Chinese, and if that we could talk about the likelihood of the Chinese sector making inroads on the global scene for a whole hour. But I just wanted maybe to look at the angle that could the current distractions created by COVID for Airbus and Boeing create an opportunity, along with perhaps the political situation that we're seeing playing out almost day by day at the moment, create an opportunity for particularly China to actually make the sort of strides that we saw Airbus make when it came into the market in the 1970s. I was going to ask Ian, actually, because you're potentially one that would be on the receiving end of that as an OEM, and then I'd ask Steve and Tim just for their thoughts, but maybe Ian, you could just give us your thoughts.
Well, I believe definitely China and Russia are the new players that are coming in. They're working on they have a huge own market to develop from. I think what we see now, if you look at the COVID situation around the world, Asia and China, obviously, that's where it all started, and it rolled westbound to the other continents, where COVID is now still very, very much in the peak in the US and in Brazil. But I believe the Chinese will come into play over the next couple of years. They will have a market which is big enough. They have a couple of products already. I think they're going after the narrow body market, going after the wide body market. So they will play a role of significance going forward.
So thank you, Steve. Do you see the Chinese, the COMAC machinery, ARJ or C919, being operating outside of? I mean, I remember O'Leary famously threatened to order the aircraft when he couldn't get the right price out of Seattle once. But what's your thoughts?
Well, I think China has the long-term objective of being a major aerospace factor in the commercial segment, and I think they have the resources and the the will to do that. I think what I see today, however, is because of the impact of the COVID and some of their intellectual property adventures to get Western technology put into Chinese products by cooperating and creating joint ventures and partial ownerships of Western enterprises that are doing things in China. I think the willingness of the Western world to partner with China has diminished significantly in the last 12 months. So the ability of the Chinese aerospace industry to latch onto and be parasitic to Western technologies, both on the airframe systems, avionics, composites, and a whole host of areas, I think is going to be far more limited. China's access to those technologies will be more limited. And I think that will be a constraining factor on the timeline that the Chinese can become competitive. The other thing where I've seen a major failure on their part is in the after-sales support. I've seen them export, for example, the MA60, which is like a twin turboprop in the ATR size category, where they have not been able to support those products out in the field. When you have AOGs, when you have engineering issues, system upgrades, airworthiness directive, service bulletins, they've just have not built the global infrastructure as has Embraer, Boeing, and Airbus and Bombardier to support their customers outside of China. And I think that's a problem both for the Russian and the Chinese airframers. How do you penetrate the export markets unless you have a massive and credible after-sales support capability? So I think the constraints on technology transfer into China and the lack of their ability to support their product outside their homeland are two major headwinds where I see great challenges for both the Russians and the Chinese.
Thanks, Steve. And just to remind us, I'm sure everyone knows, and everyone on the panel knows, but the Chinese aircraft today have Western engines. The 919 has the LEAP, CFM LEAP.
The LEAP 1C.
Yeah, which is effectively the unit that's on the Neo, I think, isn't it? And the ARJ21 has an engine you're familiar with, and it's the same power plant or as the
General Electric engine.
Yeah, the E1, right? So there is an indigenous engine in development, obviously, but that's so the export controls may well start to play in quite soon now, I guess. So Tim, we're just running into the end, but your thoughts on the idea of buying an aeroplane from the Chinese sector, the concerns that Steve mentioned about AOG support always comes up every time with the Russians in the past when they had the Pratt-powered IL-96 back in the 90s. That's always the concern that, and even for some Western manufacturers, the AOG is one of the, would that be a deciding factor, or do you just think there's overall you wouldn't be confident that that product could make it on a global scale?
Well, as Steve said, I think the Chinese are hugely aspirational to be a major player in aerospace and be a major airframer. They decided to take the easy way to do that, which was basically try and import Western technology. Now, don't forget, this technology had developed over 70 to 80 years. It had been subjected to, as we spoke earlier, rigors of design, certification, and in some cases, accidents, where people learned what had gone wrong with this. And so we built up this huge bank of information in the manufacturing in the West, both airframe and propulsion. The Chinese, to get to the end game sooner, decided to adopt as much as they could. And I'm not convinced that what they've actually produced is more than a reverse engineered DC-9 or a 320. And they've got a long way to go before they can satisfy certainly the Western markets that their aircraft at design, construction, regulation, certification, operation, and after support are up to the likes of what the West are producing today. Now, you know, and I'm not saying they won't do that. I'm not saying they couldn't do that, but they wanted to fast track the whole process. And by doing so, they've actually compromised that aspiration, in my view. And as Steve said more recently, with what has happened, the willingness of the Western companies to participate in what's going on in China is certainly, I'm not saying compromised, but it's being looked at far more seriously, as other sources of supply are being used, not just in aerospace, but other side of things. So, yeah, I think we believe that they will try and enter the frame as a player. My view is that they've got a long way to go. And they really need to start building their own airframes, designing their own frames, designing their own systems, adapting whatever technology is out there and freely available, their own propulsion. And when you get there, then you can safely say that I have an aeroplane that is fit for purpose going forward 10, 15, 20, 30 years. They're not there yet. I'm not saying they're not going to be there, but I think it's going to be more difficult for them now.
Max, do you remember when they bought a few 707s and they actually built a kind of a lookalike of the Boeing 707? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
In the 1960s.
Yeah, they just didn't quite get the cockpit arrangement right.
Yeah, they couldn't quite get it right. But, you know, we've seen that in Russia as well, where they bolt on to Western technology and try to replicate it. And as Tim said, they're not innovating new design. They're basically latching on to what's already been developed and then do a sort of modified version of that within their own capabilities. So it's really not as innovative as we would expect from China.
Right.
But to that point, I mean, Embraer has been around for 50 years. We've delivered 8,000 products to the market. And I think we've built up, as you said, respectable aftermarket support organization globally. I think they have a big home market. So, you know, in time, it will tell what they will get. But they haven't been around as long. And as you say, they're dedicated to make it happen. So I think in the end, they'll get there.
Yeah. Well, that was a fascinating discussion, everybody. Thank you so much for all your insight. There's so much we didn't have time to talk about. What do we do to replace the A380? We could have a whole chat about that, whether we stretch an airplane or there's another, maybe they relaunch the 380 in 15 years time when the market recovers. But just before we close, I'd just like to remind everybody that this webinar is available on demand via the FIA Connect site for the rest of this week. And then we'll move it on to the flightglobal.com portal next week. We had a webinar yesterday on future military aircraft. That's also available for playback on demand. And tomorrow we have the final FIA Connect webinar that Flight Global is running, which is at 3 p.m. tomorrow. And that's going to examine disruptive propulsion technology, as we talked about earlier. We also have some more webinars coming up in the next few weeks after Farnborough. Farnborough Connect concludes. The next one is on the 30th of July, and we'll examine the air cargo sector. And if you want to just check what we're up to on the webinar scene, go to flightglobal.com/webinars. That'll give you all the latest information. You can watch the playbacks there. So with that, I'd like to thank Ian, Steve, and Tim for some fantastic insight and discussion. I've really enjoyed that chat, and hopefully everyone else has enjoyed listening to it. Thanks for your questions. We got to a few of them, but there was a lot coming in. I just want to say thank you again to Ian and Embraer for supporting the webinar. Really appreciate you being on the panel as well, Ian. And with that, I'd like to thank Murdo and Chloe, my two behind-the-scenes colleagues, for making me look like a professional and keeping everything running smoothly, or trying to look like a professional at least. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for watching and wish you all a very good evening or a good morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks. See you all.